When people hear the word tariff, they often think in terms of cold numbers, percentages, import duties, a few points up or down on an economic chart. But what most don't realize is that in the upper echelons of global politics, those numbers are never just numbers. They are instruments of power. A tariff is not simply a financial mechanism. It's a signal, a flag planted on the battlefield of international influence. When the US looked at India's high tariffs, it wasn't only calculating lost export revenue, it was reading a message, and that message said, we control access to our market, and we will not bow to external pressure. That, in the world of superpowers, is not taken lightly. You see, economics is the visible face of something much deeper, a struggle over who sets the rules of the game. Trade disputes between two powerful nations are rarely about the exact monetary cost of goods. They are about leverage. The one who dictates terms in trade often dictates terms in politics, technology, and even security. That's why Washington saw India's tariff wall not as a mere irritant, but as a challenge to its status as the primary rule setter of global commerce. In psychology, there's a principle called perceived control, the belief that you are the one steering the situation. In geopolitics, that principle operates on a massive scale. If the US had simply accepted India's tariff structure without pushback, it would have signaled to the rest of the world that American economic demands were negotiable, perhaps even ignorable. And once you give up the perception of control, you start losing actual control. That is why these disputes can become so intense. They are contests over narrative as much as they are over trade. For India, maintaining high tariffs was part of a long-standing strategy of protecting domestic industries from foreign dominance. For the US, it was an affront to the notion that global trade should be liberalized, on terms that, let's be honest, tend to benefit Washington's strategic interests. This was less about mutual prosperity and more about ensuring that the hierarchy of influence remained intact. And so, the conflict became a chess game where every move carried symbolic weight. Here's the hard truth in the game of global economics. No nation willingly surrenders leverage unless it gains something greater in return, and the US, with its massive market and unmatched soft power, was unwilling to grant deeper trade access without clear signs that its influence was acknowledged. The tariff dispute was the visible spark, but the fuel was the age-old human instinct to dominate the field before the other side can. In the end, tariffs are not just numbers on a spreadsheet. They are statements of power, boundaries of sovereignty, and tests of will. And until you understand that, you will mistake a power play for a mere policy disagreement. The real fight was never about the cost of goods. It was about the cost of conceding who gets to write the rules of the world. When we talk about India's tariff structure, we have to understand that it was not some accidental, outdated policy left over from a bygone era. It was deliberate, calculated, and rooted in both history and necessity. India's economic philosophy has long been shaped by the idea of self-reliance, a belief born out of colonial exploitation, where foreign goods flooded the market and crushed local industries. High tariffs became more than a fiscal tool, they became a shield, a way to protect emerging domestic sectors from being overwhelmed by the economic muscle of developed nations. For Indian policymakers, lowering that shield without adequate preparation was not just an economic risk, it was a potential political catastrophe. From Washington's perspective, however, this same shield looked like a wall that kept out American companies, limited access to one of the world's fastest growing consumer markets, and contradicted the narrative of open, liberalized trade. The United States has always championed free trade in rhetoric, but the unspoken reality is that it expects this openness to align with its strategic and corporate interests. And so, when India maintained tariffs significantly higher than what the US deemed acceptable, it wasn't simply a disagreement over numbers, it was a clash of economic worldviews. This tension reveals something profound about international relations. Every economic policy is also a political message. When India set those tariffs, it was saying, "We'll prioritize our internal stability over your demands." That may sound reasonable from within India's borders, but from outside, especially from a superpower's perspective, it reads as resistance. And in the world of high-stakes diplomacy, resistance is rarely left unchallenged. Here's the psychological layer. Nations, like individuals, have a concept of self-identity. For India, part of that identity is the ability to chart its own economic destiny, uncursed by external forces. For the US, part of its identity is being the enforcer of an open global market, a role that cements its dominance. When these identities collide, the conflict becomes more than a negotiation, it becomes a test of pride, legitimacy, and narrative control. Some might argue that India could have lowered tariffs incrementally to avoid this standoff. But that overlooks the domestic pressures at play. Farmers, small manufacturers, and local industries are powerful voting blocs. Any sudden drop in tariffs could unleash a flood of cheaper imports, wiping out local competition and sparking political backlash. For Indian leaders, keeping tariffs high was as much about protecting livelihoods as it was about guarding sovereignty. And yet, in holding that line, India also triggered the very response it had hoped to avoid: intensified pressure from Washington. This is the paradox of protectionism. What safeguards you in the short term can become the very thing that provokes greater threats in the long term. The lesson is clear. Every wall you build in economics is also a line you draw in diplomacy, and every line you draw invites someone to test how far you're willing to defend it. The United States did not approach this situation with gentle persuasion or quiet backroom diplomacy. It deployed what can only be described as the full spectrum of pressure, a strategic mix of economic leverage, political messaging, and psychological framing. In the arena of global trade, the real negotiations often begin long before officials sit at a table. They begin with signals, public statements that set the tone, policy adjustments that hint at consequences, and subtle alliances that isolate the target. The U.S. was not simply asking India to reconsider its tariffs, it was constructing an environment in which saying no would carry a visible and escalating cost. This is the pressure playbook in action. First comes the economic threat: tariffs on Indian goods, suspension of trade privileges, or the suggestion of shifting investments elsewhere. These are not idle moves. They hit sectors that matter politically back home, stirring domestic voices inside India that begin to question whether resistance is worth the price. Then comes the diplomatic tightening, quiet conversations with other nations to limit India's alternatives, making it clear that this is not a dispute India can easily sidestep by leaning on other partners. And finally, the public narrative, framing India in international forums and media as a reluctant participant in global trade norms, subtly positioning it as an outlier that must be brought into alignment. What's fascinating here is the psychological element. The U.S. understands that in high-stakes negotiations, perception is as powerful as policy. By crafting a narrative where India appears inflexible, Washington shifts the burden of change onto New Delhi. The logic is simple but effective. If you can make the other side look like the obstacle, you increase their incentive to move first, if only to escape the optics of being the problem. India, of course, was not blind to this. The very act of resisting became a matter of national pride, but pride can be a double-edged sword in diplomacy. It can steal your resolve, or it can lead you to overestimate your position. The American strategy played on that tension, pushing just enough to test the limits of India's endurance without closing the door entirely. It was a calculated dance of pressure and restraint. What this reveals is that global trade disputes are rarely settled purely on the basis of economic data. They are contests of endurance, perception, and the ability to shape the psychological battlefield. Whoever controls the narrative controls the pace of the negotiation, and whoever controls the pace often wins. And so, while the headlines spoke of tariffs and trade deficits, the real game was about who could dictate the terms under which the conversation itself would unfold. That is why the U.S. didn't just negotiate, it choreographed the conflict, because in the theater of power, the side that sets the stage rarely loses the play. For India, lowering tariffs wasn't just an economic policy adjustment, it was a symbolic act that carried deep implications for its sovereignty and self-image. In the realm of international politics, symbolism can be as consequential as substance. When a nation publicly yields to the demands of another, it risks sending a message not only to the world, but to its own people that its economic defenses can be breached under pressure. That perception can erode public confidence, undermine political authority, and weaken a leader's standing at home. This is why the stakes were never purely financial. This was about pride, identity, and the delicate balance between cooperation and submission. The United States understood this dynamic well. It wasn't just bargaining over tariffs, it was applying pressure in a way that made the act of concession itself politically difficult for India. That's part of the strategy, make the cost of saying yes so high in terms of domestic optics that the other side resists longer than it might otherwise. In this way, the conflict becomes not just a matter of economics, but a test of willpower between two nations, each keenly aware that their response will be remembered far beyond the current negotiation. Pride in international affairs is not an abstract concept. It is rooted in the psychology of power. Leaders know that every public decision signals their capacity to stand firm or bend under external pressure. For India, with its history of colonial exploitation and its modern ambition to be a voice for the global South, yielding too quickly to Washington would have been more than a trade policy shift. it would have been a perceived retreat from its role as an independent force in global affairs. But pride works both ways. For the U.S., maintaining high pressure was also a matter of credibility. If it allowed India's tariff stance to stand without significant concessions, it risked signaling to other trading partners that American red lines could be crossed without consequence. In geopolitics, reputation is currency, and Washington was unwilling to spend it lightly. The message was clear: if you resist us, expect a price. This is why the confrontation became a contest not just of economics, but of endurance. Who would blink first? Who could withstand the short-term discomfort for the sake of long-term positioning? For both nations, the answer mattered far beyond the balance sheets. It would influence how allies and rivals perceived them in future disputes. In the end, what's most striking is that the battle over tariffs was also a battle over narrative, over who got to define the relationship as one of mutual respect or reluctant compliance. That's the hidden layer in such disputes. The trade numbers are negotiable, but the loss of dignity is permanent. And in the high arena of statecraft, nations will go to great lengths to avoid the latter, because in the world of power, the costliest concession is not measured in dollars, it's measured in pride. For India, lowering tariffs was never just about altering a line in an economic policy document. It was about the deeper question of what that change would symbolize, both to the world and to its own people. In the arena of global politics, symbolism is currency, and once spent, it cannot be reclaimed. If New Delhi had simply yielded to U.S. demands, the perception could have been that it had bowed to external pressure, undermining the very image it has worked for decades to project: a sovereign power capable of charting its own economic course, independent of foreign dictates. This is why such negotiations often become far more complex than the raw numbers suggest. Lowering a tariff from, say, 50% to 30% might seem minor on paper, but in the political imagination, it can take on a completely different weight. It becomes a precedent, a signal that persistent pressure works. And once you send that signal, you invite more pressure in the future. In this way, each concession risks being less about resolving the current dispute and more about setting the tone for every future interaction. The U.S. understood this psychological terrain well. Washington's strategy was built on the idea that a high-pressure environment would not only target India's economic policies, but also challenge its resolve. If India gave in, the victory for the U.S. would not be limited to increased market access, it would also be a reputational win, reinforcing the perception that American demands carry decisive weight. This is why the standoff over tariffs was as much a test of national character as it was a trade negotiation, and yet pride works both ways. Just as India sought to avoid looking submissive, the U.S. sought to avoid looking ineffective. If Washington backed down without extracting a concession, it risked undermining its credibility with other nations that might also resist its trade demands. Reputation in international affairs is as fragile as it is valuable. Lose it, and you lose much more than a single deal. You lose the leverage that allows you to shape future deals before they even begin. So both sides dug in. For India, the tariffs were a line in the sand. For the U.S., pushing that line was about proving the weight of its influence. This is why the conflict could not be resolved by simple economic compromise. It was, in essence, a collision between two powerful identities, each unwilling to be seen as yielding first. The truth is, in the theater of diplomacy, the battle is never just over the immediate policy. It's over the narrative that emerges when the dust settles. The story that gets told afterward shapes how nations are approached, respected, or challenged in the future. And that is why, in high-stakes negotiations, the price of protecting pride often far exceeds the price of protecting profit. Because in global power struggles, the most dangerous concession is not made at the negotiating table, it's made in the story the world tells about you afterward. When we strip away the headlines and look beneath the surface, it becomes clear that this dispute over tariffs was never just about the cost of goods crossing a border. It was about the architecture of global power, about where India and the United States position themselves in a shifting world order. Every trade negotiation carries a hidden layer of geopolitical calculation. Who do you align with? Who do you distance yourself from? What message does each move send to allies and rivals? In this case, the U.S.-India tension was unfolding in the shadow of a far larger concern: China's growing influence. Washington's push for lower Indian tariffs wasn't solely an economic desire, it was part of a broader strategic vision. If India could be drawn into deeper economic integration with the United States, it would not only open a valuable market for American industries, but also help anchor India more firmly in the U.S.-led economic and security sphere. Tariffs, in that sense, were not just barriers to trade, they were barriers to deeper geopolitical alignment. Lowering them would have symbolized not only economic openness, but also a willingness to strengthen ties in a way that counterbalanced Beijing's reach. From India's side, the stakes were just as complex. Accepting U.S. demands risked appearing as though New Delhi was choosing one camp too decisively, potentially alienating other partners and reducing its room for strategic maneuvering. India has long prided itself on maintaining a degree of non-alignment, a diplomatic flexibility that allows it to engage with multiple powers without becoming beholden to any one of them. High tariffs, in that context, were not only economic tools, but also strategic buffers, keeping relationships balanced and options open. Then there was the defense dimension. As the U.S. and India deepened military cooperation, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, each side understood that economic alignment would either reinforce or undermine that partnership. For Washington, a trade relationship weighted heavily in its favor would strengthen the broader alliance. For India, too much economic dependence could eventually erode its leverage in security negotiations. The balance was delicate, and tariffs sat right at the intersection of commerce and strategy. We often imagine that global politics moves in separate lanes, trade in one, defense in another, diplomacy in yet another. But in reality, these lanes merge constantly. A tariff cut is never just a tariff cut. It is a move in a game where each decision affects military partnerships, voting patterns in international forums, and the ability to shape the rules that govern the future. That's why this dispute mattered so much to both sides. It was a microcosm of a much larger struggle for influence in a multipolar world. And so when the U.S. said, "No deal until tariffs go down," it wasn't only drawing a line in an economic negotiation, it was setting the tone for how it intended to shape the century ahead. The fight wasn't simply over trade, it was over trajectory. And in geopolitics, trajectory determines destiny. When the United States made it clear, no deal until tariffs go down, it wasn't just a bargaining position, it was a deliberate doctrine. In negotiations of this magnitude, the first thing you establish is the order of operations: who moves first, who concedes first, and on whose terms the dialogue proceeds. By demanding that India lower its tariffs before any broader trade agreement could even be considered, Washington was doing more than setting a condition, it was framing the entire relationship. The message was unmistakable: cooperation would be built on American terms, and without those terms met, the conversation would go nowhere. This approach was high risk by design. If India refused, the U.S. risked a prolonged stalemate, potential economic losses, and a dent in bilateral relations. But if India yielded, the payoff would be substantial, not only in market access, but in the symbolic victory of having compelled a major power to act first. In international politics, getting the other side to move before you is more than a tactical win, it's a demonstration of dominance. It reinforces the perception that your conditions are the starting point for all negotiations, and that others must adjust themselves to your framework. For India, this created a dilemma. Agreeing too quickly would be interpreted as capitulation, potentially emboldening future demands not only from Washington but from other trading partners. On the other hand, holding out meant delaying potential economic benefits and risking the loss of diplomatic goodwill. This is the psychological bind in which smaller and even mid-sized powers often find themselves. When dealing with a superpower, the longer you resist, the more pressure mounts. But the sooner you concede, the more leverage you lose for the future. The no-deal stance also had a signaling effect beyond the U.S.-India relationship. Other nations were watching closely. If Washington could stand firm against India, a country with significant geopolitical weight, then it sent a message to the rest of the world: American red lines are non-negotiable. This is where the doctrine becomes less about the immediate economic dispute and more about reinforcing a pattern of expectation in all future negotiations. What makes this dynamic so interesting is that it reflects a deeper truth about power. It's not just about what you can demand, but about the credibility of your willingness to walk away. In business, in politics, and in diplomacy, the party most willing to endure short-term discomfort for long-term gain often ends up dictating the terms. The U.S. was betting heavily on that principle, wagering that India would ultimately decide the cost of resistance outweighed the benefits of defiance. And that is the essence of the no-deal doctrine. It's a test not of resources, but of resolve. It's a way of saying, we can wait longer than you can. In the end, whether in trade or in life, those who define the conditions at the outset often define the outcome itself. Because the side that sets the rules doesn't just win the negotiation, it wins the future that follows.